maybe resent is the wrong word, but I'll use it as kind of a synonym that sometimes we resent our own actions or we regret our own actions, and other times we resent the actions of others. But then I want to talk tonight about whether or not it's beneficial. It is common to feel resentment or and regret. I focused the presentation on resentment, but I think regret will be in a similar vein. Although as we go through this, if you find any exceptions, we can talk about those in the Q&A. But try to think of resentment, regret in the same light, because that's how I was thinking of them when I put the presentation together. So I would argue instead of harboring resentment, better is to learn from the negative experiences without letting them lead to disappointment. And I like to say the past is good for only two things, learning and reminiscing. If you're doing anything else, probably not a good use of thinking in the past. Um, and feel free to try to find fault with that quote. I would love if someone does, and then I'll adapt it to accordingly. So that said, da, 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 da. Sorry, that's so resentment is basically a feeling of bitterness or lingering anger towards oneself or others. That was the definition that I found when I looked it up. So there was a sense of regret over one's own actions, blame towards others' actions, and unmet expectations or perceived injustices. That's talking about what we were saying around fairness. The problem is that resentment anchors us to the past without really offering a clear path forward. And this really aligns with our devotion to self-improvement, where if we want to be the best version of ourselves, which is what we say in the first of the five intentions, we want to recognize and address our emotions to foster personal growth, which requires learning. Um, and the problem with resentment is that it impedes personal growth by keeping us fixed on the negative parts of the past, and it often hinders our ability to move forward. People are talking about lingering resentment of things, far, far, like far removed from our current life, things from the distant past. And I would argue that if we want to be the best version of ourselves, we have to let go of some of those things and focus on, the present and the future. The only value of the things that we are currently feeling resentment on is to learn the lessons that we need to learn from them. And once we do that, we want to let go and move forward. Now, it also distorts our perception sometimes because there's a thing in in machine learning, it's called overlearning, and in the human psyche, it's probably Carl would come up with the term better than me in psychology because he's a student of
Maybe
psychology.
over, maybe overthinking.
It might be overthinking it. It's when it's like when you get burned by something, then you're overly cautious about it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, right?
Yeah, I think everybody can relate to that.
Yeah, that hopefully that explains it well enough. I don't need the vocabulary, right? The point is the point, not the vocabulary.
Right.
So we like to make everything very accessible in the FTI. So I try to use small vocabulary because using terms that people don't know just to sound smart is pedantic and at best, and that pedantic just means you're using lots of big words for no good reason. And so it can make it challenging to think critically or objectively about situations when you're, harboring resentment about the past. And from a commitment to critical thinking perspective, which is part of the third intention, we want to be sure that our emotions don't impair our rational thought, because we've talked about in lots of past events how our logical thinking can get hijacked by emotional thinking, and even our emotional thinking can get hijacked by fight or flight if we feel, you know, severely threatened. So, to keep ourselves in the logical part of the brain, we don't want to have that negative emotional mindset about us. And when we get put into that resentment cloud, if you will, and have it over our heads, we're not thinking as straight as we could if we were just being rational about things and really trying to understand them. And that's where the overthinking, or what we were talking about earlier, like, the example is like, you know, you can have something bad happen to you that's like very unlikely to be a repeated case, but then you'll try to avoid doing that thing because something bad happened to you when you did it, you know? And that kind of resentment or regret can lead to, poor decisions that limit what you're able to do in your life unnecessarily. So next, I'm going to talk about transforming resentment through the five intentions. So, first is self-improvement. And if we're using that as a guiding principle, sharing our negative experiences with people offers an opportunity for personal growth. And being open-minded allows us to, you know, after sharing our opinions on, like our feelings honestly, we can be open to understanding different perspectives, which can reduce feelings of resentment. A commitment to critical thinking allows us to logically analyze any given situation and determine if resentment, is based on misunderstandings or whether or not it's quote unquote justified. And I'm going to argue, even if it's justified, it's not helpful. And the question is like, how would resentment, and this is a challenge to everybody, how would resentment ever help you more than simply identifying what it is you need to learn from the situation and the experience, learning that and putting it into practice on a go forward basis, and then letting go of the emotions, the negative emotions. If you can think of any reason that resentment is better, feel free to raise your hand in the Q&A portion because I want to hear it. I have not thought of a good reason, and I'm pretty good at shooting holes in things and finding exceptions, but I can't find an exception to that one. So next is we want to maximize happiness while minimizing harm in the Freethinker Institute, and that requires us to remember that holding on to resentment harms us more than it hurts anyone else. The truth is, even if it's causing us to cause harm to someone else, that often causes more harm to us in the long run. We're usually better off just being indifferent to someone who's caused harm to us, or learning how to avoid them whenever possible, so that we're not harboring ill will, once we've learned the lesson we need to learn and done what we need to make things as right as we can within the sphere of our influence. Now, letting go can lead to greater personal happiness, in my opinion, and a healthier mindset and more happiness for ourselves and those we can influence in the long run. Now, in the fifth intention is an eagerness to give and receive love. And there I would say embracing empathy and compassion and remembering even those that have transgressed us. I think I gave a pretty good argument when we talked about karma that there's definitely same life karma, and there's very likely, if my argument is right, post-life karma. And if so, then, realizing that anyone who's caused you harm is going to end up suffering more than the harm they caused you, and coming from a place of, not letting yourself continue to be harmed and definitely remove yourself from that situation as best you can, but also remembering that forgiveness will put you in a better place from a mindset perspective, and having empathy and compassion and sort of feeling bad for the level of negativity that that person is bringing on themselves from the negativity they brought to you, I think is a healthier perspective. Mind you, not doing that at the expense of your own well-being and not continuing to expose yourself to someone else's harm, but simply separating yourself from it if need be, or learning from it however you need to, and then letting go of the negativity after you've learned from it. So focusing on love both for ourselves as well as transgressors can diminish those feelings of resentment, and learning the lesson will reduce that chance of a negative experience happening again. So there I'm agreeing with Christ, who said, love everyone, including your enemy. I think that's still good wisdom. He didn't say hang out with your enemies all the time, right? So yes, you can love your enemy and not spend time with them. And I fully believe that he would have agreed with that. That is the right way to interpret love your enemies, not that you have to hang out with them all the time if they're continuing to cause you harm. I think we need to learn the lessons from people who cause us harm and not continue to subject ourselves to it. So that's that. So next, embracing a resentment-free mindset is where you look at mistakes as lessons, whether it's a mistake you made or someone else made. I would say better to learn the lesson and focus on learning the lesson. And I'll put out another quote that I like to say is keep your hopes high and your disappointment low. It's the only way to go. And disappointment is kind of I would actually say, and I probably would say that you don't have to be disappointed by the negativity that you've experienced. You just have to learn how to avoid it, or how to transmute it into something positive. And that positive thing may just be the lesson that you learned from the negativity happening in your life. And those past actions, whether they're ours or someone else's, really should not hold, we don't have to let it hold negative power over us or to keep us mired in the negativity. It's when we keep holding on to that negativity that it continues to cause us harm. When we learn from it, but then move on from it, we can let go of that negativity and keep moving forward as the positive people that we know we are and that we want to be inherently. Um, now, so enhancing this ultimately helps us enhance our personal development, foster better relationships, and leads to a more fulfilling life. So, in conclusion, and it's a very short presentation tonight, because I actually found this topic fairly straightforward, and you guys in the Q&A can tell me I was wrong. But for me, it's very simple, and straightforward. And that is that resentment ties us to negativity and negative past experiences, which prevent us from embracing the future positive things that we could face in our lives and embracing the positivity in the present moment. And by applying the five intentions, we can transform that resentment into an opportunity for self-improvement, understanding, and platonic love. And we also have the opportunity to learn from the past, cherish the positive memories, and focus our thinking backwards only on learning and reminiscing. And if we focus on learning and reminiscing as the only two uses of the past, I will argue you will probably be a healthier, happier person in your present and your future. So, with that said, I'm going to let Margot give a public service announcement, and then we'll go into Q&A.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. To ensure a smooth and inclusive discussion, please keep your contributions concise and for 2 minutes. If a back and forth discussion arises, we'll limit it to about 5 minutes to give everyone a fair chance to speak. The time mark will be waved at 2 minutes in green, 4 minutes in yellow, 5 minutes in red. You can comment on what someone just said, but keep it below 20 seconds. So as I said, my name is Margot Sergent, and I'm your friendly timekeeper tonight. Our goal is to create a space where all voices, introverts, extroverts, storytellers, and minimalists are heard equally. I'm going to put in the chat a few key principles of effective and respectful communication that includes clarity, openness, empathy and active listening, constructive thinking, cultural awareness. Please be kind enough to read it and to put a thumb up, so I'm sure you have read it. But above all, let's engage thoughtfully, listen actively, and keep this space respectful and open. Now let's begin.
Merci beaucoup, Margot. So who has questions or nits to pick, or challenges to issue? Go ahead, Carl.
No, nothing to nitpick. Actually, I think that was a pretty thorough and clear presentation, as usual. I was trying to think as you were sharing the slide about what I mentioned about the evolutionary purpose of emotions, which I think like every single emotion has a kind of a positive purpose. And while I agree that the negative emotions we should never dwell on and move on, I think I was trying to figure out the purpose of resentment. And I think it is connected to unfairness, which is, I think, if we didn't react in resentment to unfairness, we would never really get the alarm that something is wrong and that needs change, and to grow from that. So I kind of agree that it's useful to actually feel it, understand it, know what caused it, and then of course move on from there. I had a friend once that said that he has a 24-hour rule that whatever emotion, negative emotion he experiences, he doesn't give himself more than 24 hours to dwell on it. And in that time, he's able to, analyze and explore and grow from that, so that there's no living with a negative emotion. So that's it.
So I'm going to make the bold claim, Carl, and you can try to call BS, but I'll make the bold claim that I actually very often, but certainly not always, will skip the negative emotion, like, and just simply go to, that wasn't something that I wanted to happen. What can I learn from that? I learn the lesson and I move forward. And I
Yeah,
really don't feel negative emotions at all. I just go, that was undesirable. And as we say in Stoicism, that was a preferred indifferent. I would have preferred that had not happened, and therefore the next time I'm going to treat this a little differently. And so
yeah,
there doesn't have to be a negative emotion. You can actually short step that, skip that step if you train yourself to do so.
right,
That training does not mean stuff your emotions away. It means the opposite. It means deal with your emotions as they come up and practice what I said, which is learn the lesson from the emotions and start to realize that you don't even need the disappointment, which is why I said keep your hopes high and your disappointment low. It's the only way to go, because if you just skip the disappointment and say, you know, did I want this or did I not? And if I didn't want it, what do I have to learn from that? You don't need the negative emotions. Now, the reason they're there psychologically is to kick our ass so that we learn the lesson. And yes, that's useful. But what I'm saying is there is a better way forward, which is to skip the negative emotions and just learn the lesson of something that was a preferred indifferent. I don't
right.
know if I'm disagreeing with you or agreeing with you, Carl.
No, neither actually.
Cool. Then
No, but
maybe
you
continuing
basically,
along the path of,
yeah, yeah, yeah. You basically argued that that you do feel the negative emotion. You just it's much shorter for you.
could be,
Like the fact that you're actually able to actually recognize it, so there's an
right,
awareness, and it doesn't take 24 hours. You're just able to do it within 30 seconds or less.
right.
It's still there. You're just able to move on quicker, which is a positive.
And it might even be so short that it doesn't even register with me as more than a preferred indifferent. Like I would have preferred this not happen. Like for me, like emotions are a very strong thing, right? Like I feel emotions like I'm an empath. So when even if someone in the room is angry, I can feel their anger, right?
Right.
And like that's like for me, emotions are very strong. Whereas like what I generally experience in my lessons learned is just like a would have rather that didn't happen. All right, what do I do differently next time? Do I need to do anything differently next time? Sometimes I did all the right things, but it just didn't work out. And okay, well, try again and don't worry about it, right?
Right. Well, wouldn't you agree then that the fact that you're able to recognize it at the
Well,
moment shows that it's
It
there?
it
You're not
depends
repressing.
on it depends on what we describe as an emotion. Like for me, when I describe emotion, that's why I was saying like as an empath, I feel emotions very strongly. And so for me, an emotion means I feel a strong feeling of plus or
Mm,
negative. Whereas what I'm going through is kind of like a very even keeled, like logical, like wish that hadn't happened. It's sort of like, if you're I don't know how to describe it, but there's a bunch of hands up. So maybe I'll try to think of a better way to describe it and try to do it later. But like it's almost like something that you would have preferred not happen. Like say someone, say you don't have a pet peeve with people correcting you, right? And someone says, Garrett, your grammar was slightly off there. And I'm just like, oh, okay, you're right. Next time I'm going to use my grammar a little bit better,
yeah,
and like not even a big deal, very nonchalant, right? And you can make even things that used to upset you a lot be very nonchalant so that they don't have and maybe you're right, Carl, there is a seed of emotion at the core there because like the studies from people who don't feel any emotions are they can't even make decisions. So
right,
I
exactly.
think I am feeling an emotion.
Yeah,
It's just such a light, simple
yeah.
one that
You're able to
it's
react
not,
to it
yeah.
positively. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm keeping it in context. So, Jenna, how are you? Good to see you again. If you're the Jenna that's been here before, you're on mute, by the way.
Yeah,
Yep, go ahead.
yeah, I it's something that Thanks for the presentation. I'm late. I went to this work. So my question, I don't know if it is a question, it's just like probably a comment. You mentioned about karma earlier that when someone um did something bad to us, like we could also just consider, or as I understood it, that we could just consider that karma would take an effect to to that person who. But how about if it is our parents? For example, if they abandon us and then they come back eventually at some point in their life and they needed help, and like as a child, adult child, you just felt like you were obliged to help them. Like for me, it is like it seems like you were the one who's also, as a child, you were the one who's also like a recipient of this karma that your parent has done. Yeah, I guess that's what
Yeah.
I'm saying.
I don't think we're recipients of our parents' karma. I think we have our own karma, but I do think sometimes I think there's a misunderstanding about karma that says that just because something bad happened to you, it's because you deserved it. And I don't think that's true. I think sometimes bad things happen to us because other people choose to do bad things to us, and that's going to hurt their karma. And yes, a negative thing has happened to us, but what that means for us is we have an opportunity to transmute a negative experience to ourselves to a positive experience, and I've been lucky enough to have been able to do that sometimes in such a way that I took people who were very negative towards me and turned them around in a very positive direction. And then sometimes I fail miserably and they just get more negative. So it just depends on the situation. But I think negative things that happen to us are opportunities to learn as well. And they're not always because we did something bad. There are things that happen to us, and I do think that the example that I give of save life karma for people who don't believe in same life karma is go around insulting everyone you see all day and tell me if they don't treat you badly. I will bet you almost everybody will treat you badly. And if there's one person who's nice to you, that person is very spiritually aware. Um, so that's what I call same life karma is, the clear cause and effect of if you put bad things out into the world, they do come right back at you, usually quite quickly. And metaphysical karma is a much longer argument that I made another night. And if you want, you can go to the Freethinker Institute channel on YouTube and look that one up. If it's not there, let me know and we'll repeat it. Because we did lose some events, but we did do an event on karma.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, I kept looking at the YouTube channel
Yeah, and
for the past.
we may
Thank
run
you.
out of questions here, and if people want to hear my argument defending metaphysical karma, I'm happy to share it. I just want to respect the topic that everyone came for, and so I want to answer all questions in that regard first. So, Carrie, go ahead.
All right. So, this idea of resentment, bitterness, anger, whatever, it seems like, all right, I'm going to call that an emotional state.
Yep.
And yes, emotional states are probably partially nurture, partially nature, but they're reactive for most folks most of the time, right? It's not like we sit there and have a rational process deciding how we're going to, emotionally respond. We get the response, the emotional response, and then we think about that. But it is subject to rational modification after the fact. And I think what's important here is when we take offense, the offense happens within us, right? That is something that we evaluate some behavior as being like intentionally disrespectful or violating decorum or respect or whatever it is, right? But that may not be the case, right? Some people clearly try to offend other people
Oh,
and
yeah.
try to be disrespectful, but not always.
Zoom
Like,
bombers. They're trying hard.
great point. But you
Yeah.
know what's funny?
And now
And
I'm making fun of the Zoom bombers. What can I say? I couldn't help it.
yeah, but this is a great example. What I've
Yeah.
noticed is that when you respond to a Zoom bomber with not automatically being highly reactive,
Yeah,
it disarms them quite a bit.
it does.
And I think that there's something to be said for trying to be more rational about this and saying, hey, wait a minute, before I take too much offense, am I even reading the situation right? Let's try to communicate first. And then I can make a decision. If somebody's just trying to be a jerk, okay,
Yeah.
fine. But that's them. I don't
I
necessarily have to wreck my whole day because of
totally.
their choices.
I've also definitely had people tell me someone was a Zoom bomber that I was patient with and turned out not to be a Zoom bomber. I've also had people that I myself thought was a Zoom bomber, and I said, let me be extra patient with this person, and they turned out not to be a Zoom bomber. And so I've also had people that I was extra patient with that were definitely Zoom bombers. But like, what are you going to do? Like, I'd rather give people the benefit of the doubt until it's really clear that they don't have good intentions. So I'd much rather be guilty of giving someone the benefit of the doubt than by, bumping them out when, they might not have been. There have been times where I made mistakes and I've bumped people out when I shouldn't have, but it was usually because we got really abused by Zoom bombers for, 20, 30 minutes. And I was like at a point where I was low patience and where honestly the audience was at a point of low patience. And so I have booted people out when I shouldn't have, but it's pretty rare.
Mhm.
But I think if I could, Carrie, say, it sounds like you're saying that resentment as an emotional state is, if I read or heard you right, is that you feel like it's kind of unavoidable, like the emotional response.
I think we can modify our responses, but boy, that's the difficult portion. I
It
think
is.
the more accessible thing that I think we can all do is before we start going off on a tangent, take a deep breath and make sure that we're at least assessing the situation properly. Because as you mentioned, sometimes we can get it wrong.
Yeah.
And
And
now
that's
we're
why,
just creating a bunch of
Mhm.
unnecessary nastiness
right.
between two people that's not necessarily based in reality.
Exactly, which happens all the time. And that's why, I tell everybody that will listen, when someone upsets you, ask them, did you mean X that you felt like upset you?
Mhm.
And I have found when I do that, 80% of the time they go, no, no, that's not what I meant. Right. And oh, wait, then I had a misunderstanding and I just got offended by my misunderstanding of what you said or did. And so, always better to ask for clarification. So we're getting time messages. So we're gonna go to Carl next.
Yeah, actually, I was going to comment on that. 2 points
Yeah,
on
go ahead.
that. One is that there is a difference between emotions and feelings, and so the emotions will be that initial biological response that you have. Feeling is how your brain labels it, the meaning behind it. So there's been studies done where you could have the exact same biological response, but two different meanings depending on the context. Um, and the other point I was going to make that's related to that. Oh, it's the which goes along with what Carrie said. It's about the response. So we will have an emotional feel, right? The emotion, the feeling, and then the response, which happens very, very quickly. And I always recall Viktor Frankl's quote about that between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. And in that space, it's your choice on how you respond. That is the freedom. And you're right. Not everybody can do that quickly. And a lot of people assume and misunderstand. But yeah, that is what something to look forward to in terms of that you have complete control of how you respond to your emotions and to all the triggers out there.
Yeah,
That's it.
completely. And that's actually, when I say that one of our goals in the FTI is to be the best version of ourselves, which Carl, I don't know how we've let you not become a member of the FTI for this long. You should really join.
I I think I follow Groucho Marx's thing about I would never want to be a member of a group that wants me.
I knew that one. So,
Just
so,
kidding, just kidding.
but I guess one of the things that we want to strive to do is to like get better at having that space where we decide how we want to respond to stimuli. And that's what I think we can help each other do as members of the FTI, where we apply practical wisdom into our daily lives which I forgot to introduce myself tonight. I usually do that, and that is part of my intro. But for anyone that wants to learn more about the FJ, I'll put more info in the chat. And Mandy, go ahead.
Hello.
Hey, how are you? Good to see you again.
Um, Resentment. Okay. I think resentment is good if you want people to do your dirty work. Um, everything you spoke about is fine when you're in, sorry to use these kinds of words. I don't know what other words to use. And if you know what words I should use, let me know. But if you're in the middle class, yeah, fine. You all have the understanding of language. You all understand bringing some awareness. But when you're in the lower classes, resentment is really good to get people to do your dirty work. You you're in a place where you're already feeling injustice, and a gathering of us, we can all be gathered with the same kind of thought, and then we create a lot of distress for others, particularly the middle class. And I say this also as a where I work as a union member. I see there as well where a perceived injustice against management, and then there'll be a bunch of resentment that's created where nobody is interested. Oh, not nobody's interested. Not everybody has that understanding to do the self-inquiry. So I can see that it is a good thing for people who want to create chaos. Is that making any sense?
I'm not sure if I understand. When you say it's a good, the last part made sense where it's maybe good for people who want to create chaos, but I would argue, you know, wanting to create chaos is not a pure motive. Like it's not a good motive to have. And even in your situation where I think what you were saying is that for a lower class person who's being taken advantage of, feeling, I think you were saying that feeling resentment against the middle class for taking advantage of them will
Mm-hmm.
make them feel guilty. Did I hear that right?
Will make who feel guilty?
The middle class.
I don't know if it makes the middle class feel guilty, but when
Actually, though, if I may, I was just
Yeah.
wondering, Mandy, I was going to ask you just to clarify what you meant by having other people do your dirty work, because I
Yeah,
didn't really
could you
quite.
clarify that, Mandy? That's a good question.
For an idea?
say you've I'll have to use maybe a race issue
Yeah.
where
Okay.
Can I use, I
something
was the Tesla issue, right? That there's a lot of
yeah
people now vandalizing Teslas, and I'm gonna bet that they are resentful
yeah
of Elon Musk, and so that's what they're doing,
yeah
right? Is that what? Yeah, right.
yeah something like that, things like that where someone can see it for what it is, where they've wronged us, they've taken advantage of us. The middle class have gone from lower classes into the middle class, and then they've forgotten about us, giving us a hand up, and now we're going to be resentful of them. So that stuff that they spent money on, buying the car, buying it, well, let's just rob them then, right? There you many, I don't know, gangs maybe somewhere along the line, like you can get people to who are already in a vulnerable state and who haven't had that level of education to understand that let's forget about blaming them. Let's take a look inside first of where your hurts are, where the inner work needs to do, like inner work and these kinds of things. These are middle class terms, right?
Why do you think they're middle class terms, Mandy?
Because I didn't know them when I was in the lower classes.
Well, haven't you learned them?
No, I learn them now, but I cannot not forget where I'm coming from
I'm
and
not asking you
realizing,
to at all. I mean, I come from fairly lower class as well, but that doesn't mean we can't learn from
yeah, you
where
can,
you're
but you,
in.
yeah,
And once we
Yeah.
do, and that's all I was saying tonight, is that the negative emotions will inhibit us from acting in a way that shows that we learned the lesson from whatever it is we resent. And
Yeah, but
instead of,
if you have 20 odd years of having that habit of blaming others or resentful, it's not that easy to kick out of. And also, in the place that I work, is an educational institution, there's people there 10, 15 years, never taken a course again. And it made me think that, okay, after high school, then maybe you did some college and then you never take a course again. You see how the mindset, like, where would you get education again if you're not going to school?
right. Well, here at the FTI is one place.
Yeah.
So, um,
No, this is
that's why we're
fantastic.
here, is to educate people in a lifelong pursuit of education. In
Yeah.
fact, we're going to have another event on why lifelong learning is so important. But to that point, Mandy, like, yes, it's hard to break a 20-year pattern. It is. But I'm not here to only tell people to do things that are easy, and anyone who doesn't have your best interests at heart. I'm going to ask you to do hard things.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm going to say to do hard things and what I asked you to do tonight is not easy, right? But trying to step past resentment and go straight to the learning without the negative emotions, it's not easy, but I think
No.
it will benefit you.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work and I'm not in that place. But because I'm not in that place, I'm able to move myself out and look at it for what it is and
Right.
see how, especially with culture and race and stuff, that it's easy to collect a bunch of youth who are already feeling injustice with not getting work, being discriminated against, and having them play out um, stuff against people with good cars or houses or stuff, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And another point, you said something about Christ, and Christ is, for me, understanding is consciousness, because the lad that you're actually talking about, his name's Yeshua.
Well, yeah, I
So,
mean, like, how are you distinguishing from Christ versus Yeshua?
because Christ is a state of consciousness.
What do you mean?
Oh, I think we muted. Oh, here we go.
Yeah, you muted me. Did you not want to hear that? Sorry.
I didn't
Is that
mute you. Someone did it
is
by
that how you
accident.
like sort of diss me by muting me? Is that what's going on?
No, that was
Hope
accidental.
you're kidding. Good.
But yeah, Christ, or actually Krishna consciousness, it's a level of consciousness at the top, and Yeshua got to that. Buddha got to that, and Krishna got to that.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. We're
Thank
getting
you.
into different terminology. Thank you. Thank you, Mandy. And Alan, go ahead next.
Okay, thanks. Anyway, I just back to what the lady was saying. I've worked in professional organizations and I was a kind of president of my professional association for quite a few years anyway, and we're all fairly well educated. We probably came from similar backgrounds. Some were from well-off backgrounds, but there was never there is resentment, but it's not a resentment for management just because of jealousies or things like that. It's legitimate labor issues that occur in a workforce, and resentment is just part of the development process in any organization. You have to deal with it, and just like you were saying in your commentary, it's something we can learn from. And good communicators, they always just ignore the kind of negative things where they could resent. They react fairly shortly for it, and then they try to find ways to solve the problems. And resentment is just a kind of a reactionary emotional kind of state that helps us overcome problems or stay focused on our own goals. And yes, some people are really good communicators use it to kind of manipulate, or well, maybe not manipulate, but to mobilize people. And maybe in a labor environment, you got to get people moving, because collective action has to be collective. Otherwise, you don't get a good result. And that's with anything like civil rights or whatever. You often you can't achieve results in civil rights or human rights, whatever, without some sort of collective action. But that doesn't mean that it's dirty work. That's just part of kind of communicating to the public to how things are done. And anytime when, like, where I've done volunteer work where we've tried to communicate to public, we've had a clear agenda to people, say that this is what we want to do, this is what the goals are, and if you like it, please join. And we want to put pressure on our government, or whatever area controls it, to make some changes to make our lives better. So, but with respect to resentment, it's really beneficial to us to learn and improve ourselves. The more challenges we have, the better we become with dealing with life. I know myself, I was a pretty introverted person many years ago. And I joined some of these groups just to learn from them. And I talked to the people there and said, well, how do you deal with when someone criticizes you and tries to belittle you? And they would say, oh, well, we just take it. That's part of the job. Don't worry about it. You can become a good speaker. You can do whatever you want. And I'm not a good speaker, but I try to do the things that give me difficulties, and I get better. Same with work. I used to be, I didn't know anything about, I was really bad in programming and stuff like that, but I took on the most difficult assignments and work assignments, and I became pretty good at it after 2 or 3 years. I was given the opportunities to make mistakes.
Try to finish
And
it out when you can, Alan.
anyway, that's so as you said, it's a learning opportunity.
No worries. So I'm gonna try to take a little bit of a different approach and say you were saying resentment is just part of the development process in any organization. I don't think it
Yeah.
needs to be. You were also saying that it needs to be a part of getting people motivated, and I don't think it needs to be there either. I think you can actually make logical, rational arguments in defense of civil liberties, of human rights, of all these things. I think that emotions are very often used to rile people up. Sometimes emotions are used for, when they are also backed by a rational argument. But I would argue you can actually make the rational argument without the emotions and still motivate a fair number of people. And I would like to see a world in which more people are motivated by rational arguments than by emotional arguments. Unfortunately, according to the research by Jonathan Haidt, like more people make rational or make emotional decisions and then justify them with rational thought. So you're right about where we are today. I would like to see a world where reason is what motivates us and guides us rather than the emotional arguments and etc. Does that make sense, Alan?
Oh, it does. I think that's great. I wish more of the world would be like that.
Yeah, and I think we have to start to be the change we want to see, right? And so we have to ourselves kind of step back from the emotions, and when we start to feel them, to calm down, to meditate, and to get ourselves to think less emotionally, and then think about things rationally. And if we can do that ourselves, and then we gradually practice, reducing the emotions that we're feeling when something happens. And that's not again, it's not stuffing your emotions down when they come up. It's about circumventing them so that they don't come up as highly in the first place. And so that you're looking for what can I learn from this situation, not, how should I, like of just like responding without thinking through it. And if you look at things as, I just need to learn what I need to learn from this, and that's what your goal is, and try to not look at things as good or bad, in terms of looking at the past, just to say, I prefer this or I don't prefer this, which is what Stoicism teaches, is preferred indifference. Things you can't control are supposed to be preferred indifference. Things that you may prefer, you may not prefer, but you don't get emotional about them. You just say, I wish that had not happened, and so I'm going to learn from it. Does that make sense, Alan?
Oh, yeah, it does. Yeah.
May
Cool.
I just say, Garrett,
Yeah.
just real quickly, I appreciate Alan for sharing his personal self, if you want to call it. So I
Yeah,
appreciated that. Thank you.
I agree. That's what we want to be able to do. And that's what authentically, transparently and authentically sharing our opinions is about. And that's one of the five intentions of the FTI is we want to be able to share from the heart with each other. Even though we're in a group, we want to be able to share our personal experiences. And I'm not trying to invalidate your personal experiences, Alan, just to say there is another possibility other than what we're experiencing today. And what you're experiencing is probably the norm. I just think that it
Mhm.
doesn't have to be that way.
Oh, thank you. I agree with you. I'd like to see the world changed.
Yeah. So that's what we're here for, is to change the world for the better. So,
Yeah.
um, Dale's Thales, or how do you pronounce it? Sorry, you said it earlier.
Thales.
Thales. How are you, Thales? Is it Greek?
Yes, it is Greek.
Okay. It's
Thales was actually a philosopher. He's the father of Western philosophy.
I know the name from philosophy, but I didn't remember who he was. So thank you.
hmm Um, I just wanted to comment that I believe there are different levels of resentment that you can find something or be resentful of something very simple, like somebody calling you stupid, and that's relatively easy to deal with. But then there are other things that people do to you, like they could cause you to be crippled for the rest of your life. And that's a much harder thing to deal with. I just wanted to get some comments and feedback on that.
I agree with you that the more, and I'm gonna go out to say the more unfair something is, the harder it can be to get over. But I would argue that doesn't mean that it's just because it's harder to get over that it's more justified. I think we still need to learn the lessons we need to learn from whatever happened, not be emotional about them. Because, if you are crippled for the rest of your life due to an injustice, being angry about it all the time and treating everyone, being negative towards everyone because you had this negative thing happen towards you is not going to help you find allies towards fairness, right? And if you want the fair thing to happen, you need to hire a lawyer, you need to get, you need to recruit a team to support you in bringing justice to bear. And you're not going to be able to recruit and keep that team motivated if you're angry all the time and you're resentful all the time because that negativity will consume you if you let it. Negativity, and that's where I'll bring another quote that I really like from the Native American Cherokee. I think it was Sitting Bull, and it's basically in my the grandfather tells the grandson, in my head there are two wolves. One is angry and mean and spiteful, and the other one is loving and caring and kind. And they're always battling and fighting each other. And the grandson says, well, which one wins? And the grandfather says, the one you feed the most. And if you're so busy being resentful about what horrible thing happened to you, you'll never be focused on creating the fairness that you really want to see in the world. Whereas if you say, well, what do I learn from that lack of fairness? And you say, how do I bring about justice? Then you're going to have a much better chance of actually bringing it about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. It's just a difficult thing to deal with.
Definitely. And remember, I said I'm not going to only ask easy things of people.
Yeah,
Because again, like, I like to say the easy things are not the ones that are worth going after. It's the hard things that are usually worth going after. Not the hard ones that don't have a meaning to them, but the hard things that add meaning to our lives and add value to our lives, those are things that are worth going after.
right. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question and comment. I agree with a lot of what you said. I just wanted to add my 2 cents. So, Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, so is basically a subset of anger management generally? Like I'm thinking that supposedly anger is the result of a number of things. It could be fear, frustration, stress, sense of injustice, disrespect. And it seems like the resentment angle is like a form of anger, and we're focusing on the injustice and disrespect portion. Or is this something that's decidedly different in your view?
I'm sorry, say that again, Carrie. Sorry, I was reading the chat, which I shouldn't be
No
doing.
worries. I'm wondering how this discussion relates to anger management generally. Do you think that this is a
Yeah.
subset of anger management or something that's actually different?
So I think it's a subset of emotional management, not anger management. Anger is one of the emotions that comes up from resentment, but it's not the only one. You know, resentment is probably a more specific keyed in emotion. And so, but anger can come from resentment and vice versa. And so they're interrelated emotions, but I think the more important part is emotional management and managing our emotions in such a way that, and this took me, you know, a while. Like I used to get angry really easily, and I read the book Emotional Intelligence by Gorman, and I started reading about how he was talking about like look for the early precursors of emotions, catch it early on before you're like full blown into an emotional response. And I kept going earlier and earlier and earlier and catching myself before I got into a situation where my emotions were out of control. And now I'm in a good spot where not all the time, but a lot of the time I don't even get into like noticeable emotions like I talked about. Now they're there, I'm sure, like underpinning my response, but like they're so subtle that I don't even necessarily feel them much. And so I think by learning to manage our emotions, we become much more capable actors for the force of good that we all want to fight for. And I forget which ancient Greek said, we all see ourselves as good people. He said men because it was a misogynistic world, but I'll translate in modern vernacular. We all see ourselves as good people. And so yeah, I would just argue it's emotional management. Does that make sense?
I actually
Absolutely.
think it's in the definition of resentment. It's supposed to be a bitter anger at being treated unfairly. So anger
Okay,
is resentment. Yeah, for sure.
cool.
Yeah.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah. I guess my view on resentment is that, like, the purpose of resentment is to push you to address the thing that's making you resentful in the first place. And it's also something that it tends to be a kind of long-term emotion. Like if someone's rude to you once, you generally don't resent resent them for a long while. Maybe you do if you're like particularly sensitive. But I do think that since it's meant to push you, I do think that if you rationalize too quickly, it may lead you to not fully addressing what's causing you to be resentful in the first place. Because uh, obviously, like the end goal is to not feel resentful. But if you rationalize it too quickly, which can easily happen if you don't have all the like variables that cause it in your mind, it might just keep cropping up and you might just keep hammering it back down. So I do think like at least holding the emotion in its space to really pick at it is probably more the way to go. As long as like you're not making any rash decisions, of course.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I do agree with you that the reason that psychologically we feel resentment is to get us to respond, but I don't agree that it's necessary for us to respond. I would say that you know, if someone's rude and your response was if you rationalize too quickly, you may not like actually address it. Well, I would argue that's actually stuffing down your emotions and not paying attention to them. And I think when you get good at addressing your emotions in a timely manner, which I'm pretty good at, even though I don't feel as intense emotions when something I don't like happens, I always address it. And it's important that you do address it because when you don't address your emotions, they will, you know, blow up on you later. When you stuff down your emotions, they're going to blow up later on. So you have to, and that's why I say stuffing down your emotions is not the solution. And when I'm saying that I have muted emotional responses, it's not because I stuff them down. It's not because I ignore them or say I can't feel that or I shouldn't feel that. I don't do any of that. I just say, what do I need to learn from this? Right? And I do pay careful attention to what I need to learn from things that I don't like. And if I don't like something, I'm going to do something about it. And you know, so I do think we need to take action. All I'm saying is if you get good at taking action without the emotion involved, like without a strong emotional response, you can actually learn to address your emotions without succumbing to your emotions. Does that make sense?
Aren't you talking about equanimity here?
Yeah, it is kind of equanimity, yeah. For that, then we're getting into big vocab words, Carl, but that was my long way of
Yeah,
saying
I mean
equanimity.
that's that
Strive for equanimity, yes, Buddhist. Yes,
calmness in
yes,
difficult situations where you're not reacting majorly. Yeah,
yeah.
but you still feel the emotion. Yeah,
Yeah, you do, but it's muted,
yeah.
and it's
Muted.
not muted. It's not muted because you're suppressing it. It's muted because you're dealing with the root cause of the emotion rationally, in a calm, cool, collected way, and you're addressing your emotion so well that your mind doesn't feel like it has to lash out with resentment because you've already addressed what it wants to address.
Right.
You don't even need the emotional response. If you get so good at addressing your emotional root causes that you don't need the emotional response, then it's not necessary anymore. I hope that makes sense. It's a little, yeah. Um,
Right.
Clyde, how are you?
Good. I've heard you use the term fairness a lot.
Yes.
What is fairness?
So that's a great question. And in the FTI, I have a very clear definition of fairness, which is first, we should prevent significant unnecessary harm from happening to any human being, full stop, whenever we can possibly influence it. And then two, after we've done that, to increase happiness and decrease harm in the world or for the people we can influence to the extent we can influence the people with being the priority. And if you want, I can define those more clearly too. I get all the way down to the nth degree of detail on the definitions here.
All right. I do have a quick one for Clyde.
Yeah.
Impartial and just treatment or behavior without favoritism or discrimination.
I get a little more clear. But I think
That's a
that's
good one.
good. I'm not trying to diss the
It's only
dictionary.
the Oxford Dictionary.
I'm
I
not
mean,
trying to diss the dictionary, but I think the FTI's definition of fair is actually a little more actionable than that because that requires more interpretation, whereas mine actually has a litmus test of, what constitutes, like
just treatment.
fairness with a more clear measurement system.
What was your definition again?
To prevent significant unnecessary harm from happening to all human beings that we can influence, full stop. And then two, once that's done, to increase happiness and decrease harm. And I'm shortcutting. If you go to our presentation on wisdom, I gave this whole definition in a lot of detail, including formulas about net present positivity, which is basically trying to increase the happiness and decrease the harm over one's lifetime for all the people that we can influence.
Okay.
I think a lot of the problems in our society, a lot of the conflict in our society comes from people throwing around words and not defining them. Offensive, that's another one of those words. Fairness, disrespect. We have a lot of abstract, subjective words. And I don't know if I've ever been in a conversation where someone says, okay, this is what I mean by saying something's unfair. I mean, some
Hey,
words are, I
Clyde,
mean,
Clyde, didn't we do that tonight?
yeah, we did, but I'm saying
So you gotta
that's
have
uncommon.
you have to have one instance in your life that someone did that, right?
Right. You're
Now
right, right.
we're the first. No,
You're
you're
the
right though.
first.
You're right though, Clyde. I'm teasing, but I'm teasing a little bit for a good reason. We do try really clearly to define our terms well here and
Long-term.
to define what we mean by things. And the FTI's five intentions are very well defined. I'm actually writing an entire book on them,
Uh,
so they're very well defined. And it's mostly written. Lynn helped with that. So kudos to Lynn for all her help with that. And so so yeah, I would actually argue you're very right. And in fact, when we talked about DEI, I found that when I defined what DEI means, the very people who came to the meetup saying that they didn't like DEI were actually supporting what DEI really stands for. They just didn't like a version of DEI that someone pointed out for them that wasn't really the definition of DEI by the people who actually, are the proponents of DEI. And so, you're right. People actually get into whole arguments like family feuds over terms that they don't have a common agreement on, which is why it's always so important that if you're starting to disagree with someone, you ask thoughtful questions to understand where they're coming from. And we call that listening to understand in the FTI, where you say, look, it sounds like you don't like DEI. What do you mean by DEI? And when I asked that of someone, they said, well, I don't want people to get a job that don't deserve the job. And I'm like, great, that's what DEI says. DEI just wants to make sure the best person for the job gets the job. And they're like, no, that's not what DEI says. And I'm like, well, here are the 6 sources of DEI that say that's exactly what they're trying to do. Where's your definition of DEI? And they weren't able to come up with one that had their definition. So, that's where you start to get into a look, by their definition of DEI, I don't agree with it either. But by the definition of DEI of people who support DEI, I do agree with it. But if you look at what Trump calls DEI, I'm very much against. But so is DEI. So,
Right.
I would add also that my man Socrates, 2,500 years ago, said that defining your terms should be the beginning of any philosophical discussion.
Yes, and Socrates was a wise man, to quote Bill and Ted. So, for anyone that's old enough to know who Bill and Ted were in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. So, Ari, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing? I hope
Good.
everybody's
Yeah.
well. I want to challenge some things and hopefully
Please.
keep everybody in an open mind, but also be a little bit of a barrister here for certain things that I was going to challenge the idea. I'm going to do it in a second point. I'll talk later more about what I think we're misrepresenting emotions in general. And the way I would say emotions is an analogy that's a little overly reductive, but still highly accurate, is emotions in general are like fertilizer. A small amount really helps create healthy growth, and too much just stinks. And the same goes for both anger and resentment. I think resentment, if we were going to describe it in a very generalized way, the like I'm 5, is essentially just being really negative or feeling a certain negativity to something. But for instance, let's say I like the idea if someone stole from me in the past, being resentful is essentially more like having regret. And that is like having poison and wishing them to drink it and you just drink it yourself. But for instance, if someone is currently stealing from me right now, and me fostering a sense of resentment towards that leads me to have clarity about how to distance myself from this person or take action, right? Call the police. So a healthy amount of resentment is really constructive. It's generally what you're saying about using our emotions as management tools. And I really, again, resent the idea that when we have a negative emotion, as much as I'm going to pick on Kerry because I really like what he said, but there's this falseness of A equals B and B equals C and then D equals E. We missed a link, which is that if we feel resentful, we automatically go to being a reflexive, negative, emotional response. And if that's the case, absolutely true, totally bad. But if we have resentment with a healthy level, what you call rationalism, which I'm going to argue against later of what really rational is, because rational emotional are really actually, from a neuroscience point of view, a whole brain experience that can't be broken down into this false dichotomy. But when we take a rational approach where we make a higher level, more granular level of conceptualization to an emotion, we see resentment is like, oh, this person is stealing from me, I'm going to end my relationship with them. Or this person is abusive towards me, it leads me towards making a healthy decision. Resentment is there, fantastic. It's the fertilizer that leads to good growth. And similar with anger, anger is often attributed to the hijacking of the feeling of the amygdala and the hypothalamus that I just run rampant and I lose my rational sense of self by getting too activated. But a small amount of anger, when we essentially see something as negative or an injustice, it leads to us doing something really good. I would argue that Rosa Parks sitting in the back of the bus was angry. The difference was, and this is a very well-developed idea in psychodynamics, usually the Jungian school and also the Adler school, is that anger is not the same thing as aggression. When we assume that we're angry, we just start to get aggressive. And that means I'm angry and I'm going to start controlling everything around me and essentially act like a tyrant. But if I'm angry and that creates a measured response where I'm thoughtful and reasonable and do something perhaps really constructive, then anger is a very healthy tool. And this is why anger is as like any emotion is a neutral object, like a hammer. It can be used to hurt someone and kill someone, or it can be used to build a house, right? It's essentially neutral. And when we are used to seeing certain emotions hijack people, that makes a lot of sense. That's basically people still behaving like children. But when we have clarity with our emotions, which I'm going to argue later, emotions are all about bringing salience and focus to what's happening in reality. It focuses our attention. What we do with that attention is a separate issue. And to say that these things are intrinsically linked is a false, I'm failing for words here, but it's not a necessary action that's going to happen. And it's a false assumption. It's just an assumption that is not true.
So
When we
what's
have
the false
emotions,
assumption? Say the
that
false
when we have a
assumption.
certain emotion, that it leads us to a specific reaction, or like if I'm angry, I'm assuming I'm just going to be, a monster and get like aggressive. But for instance, in the arguments of that anger is just recognizing an injustice and something that I want to do about it. Well, if it completely takes us over, like the fertilizer model, then it just stinks and messes everything up. But in a small amount, in a healthy, measured way, where we have a deliberate, unified, very constructive sense of self and the environment around us, we can use this tool to very much bring us into attention and then what we should healthily do with that attention. But the assumption is that once we get this feeling, it takes us over like a demon. That is what I would call a pathology, or very much a hijacking of specific parts of the lower brain, the hypothalamus and the amygdala, that
Try to
are
finish.
just not are
Try to
not
finish your
really
thought.
necessary, right? We don't. That's a false. That's assumption that is not true. And so again, back to my original hypothesis thesis is that both resentment and anger and any emotion, in their measured prescribed amount, in a healthy dose, is always going to be constructive. And this is kind of what you're talking about with emotional management.
Yeah. And I think we're saying the same thing, which is that when you have emotions under control, it's okay to have an emotion, but it's got to be completely under control if you want to have a measured, thoughtful response. And I like the quote from Aristotle, which says, anybody can become angry. That is easy, but to be angry with the right person and to the right degree and at the right time and for the right purpose and in the right way, that is not within everyone's power and is not easy. So Aristotle also asked people to do difficult things, and I would argue he's right. And I think Carl is right. It's not that I'm not feeling any emotion. It's just that, like fertilizer, and I think your example is very good, takes very little fertilizer. We put fertilizer on our plants, like a little bit of fertilizer in a plant, like at the beginning of the planting season, at the end of plant, like midway through the planting season or near the end, and then that's it, right? Very little
Yeah.
fertilizer is required. Very little
And too
emotion.
much will kill it.
Yeah, exactly. And very little emotion is required. You need enough to act because, as they've shown in psychology studies where people have a brain that doesn't sense emotions anymore, they can't make decisions. So yes, there needs
Right.
to be some emotion, but you need to have emotional management so that you're not responding out of emotion or for emotional reasons. You should be responding for rational reasons. And so if your main impetus in your response is rational rather than emotional, which I would argue that when you're feeling what I was describing as intense emotions, those are not the times where you're responding rationally. They're the times when you're responding emotionally. And so I think we're saying the same thing, Ari, even though you started out saying you
Yeah.
were disagreeing with me.
Well, the only disagreement that I'm making is, and it's maybe nuanced, and that's great, is that I'm saying that these are inherently good, and like any tool, like a hammer, it has great potential for good. It also has great potential for bad. And so I don't like that we're just thinking it's okay, or it's like justifiable after the fact. I'm saying they're inherently can be really useful and even necessary. Like you said, someone who doesn't have emotions doesn't able to make decisions. What we're also saying in the neuroscience world is that someone who doesn't have emotions can't make predictions. And this is just you're unable to conceptualize. And so this is essentially what emotions are. They're called emotion concepts that are related to goals, right? This is tremendously necessary for being an intelligent person.
Yeah. So all I would say is that the negative emotions are, like feeling the negative emotions in any intense way is not necessary. And you need to feel enough negative emotion to say this is undesirable, but no more than that. If you feel enough negative emotion to say this is undesirable, and then you move on to the rational response and what do I learn from that negative stimulus and how do I learn from it, then you've moved in a good direction.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's great. Yep.
Thanks,
I'll
Ari.
make my next point around. Except nobody has their
Yeah,
hand up, so I don't
next,
want to hijack
Ned, put your
the
hand up again
conversation.
because we
Yeah.
only do
Oh, there are people.
one.
Sorry, I see.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's four hands up. So put your
My
hand up
apologies.
again and then we'll come back
Sounds
around.
good.
Cool. Thanks. Jenna, go ahead.
Thanks, Garrett. I just wanted to comment on the emotional reactivity. I think sometimes it is tied on one's belief regarding freedom of speech that we tend to just express, articulate our emotions, what we think, but merely not listening to others. So that's I think that it also affects on how we um, we interpret what other people are saying. That even if they are not disagreeing to what we are thinking or saying, it seems like even if they're also just saying some nuances, it could feel like that they are directing something against us. And with the regret and resentment that Ari was saying earlier, I think that regret is towards ourselves, directed towards ourselves, and resentment is towards others. And additional with the Rosa Parks, I know that it stems from anger, but I think it's more of like a righteous indignation that she wanted to like change something regarding fairness and equality at that time. So those are the word of my comment. Thank you.
I was having a little trouble hearing you, Jenna, so I'm not sure if I understood. I don't know if someone else can respond better than me right now.
Oh, okay. Is my internet still spotty? Can you hear me all right
Yeah,
now?
go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so where did I stop? Like, not making sense in what I'm saying.
You
Or
didn't not
like,
make
in
sense. I just
general.
had trouble. I don't know, maybe it's just been I've been up for a long time today. So, I can you maybe summarize what you were trying to get across?
There's a lot of
Yeah,
feedback
so
and I
like,
can't hear what she's saying.
Yeah, it's a
Can't
you're a
understand
little
distinct
unclear,
feedback.
Jenna. I guess it's not just me.
if I
It's a
think I
little
was just gonna
fuzzy.
write it in the chat. I was just gonna write it in the chat. It's probably my internet connection. I'm outside. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Um, Carrie, let's have you go, and then after you, I'm gonna read what Jenna has to say in the chat.
Sounds good. Okay, so this is, I guess, a response to Ari, which I think is a really interesting point. And it's this idea of, when we make decisions, we can do them based on emotions or we can do it based on rationality, or at least that's the common perception, right? I mean, I've often heard it said that emotional decisions are rarely good decisions. But what I'm wondering is if we drill down, are there types of results we get from emotional decision making that offer a positive benefit that aren't available with rational decisions? On the other hand, are there things that we don't, uh, that rational decision making doesn't encourage? So we're missing this important subset of possible outcomes. And then what are the risks? And is it a cost benefit analysis where if I am making emotional decisions, do I have a 90% chance of making a really horrible decision? But there's this like 5% of really good outcomes that I might not, be aware of. So maybe we should explore both options and compare them. Or do we just say, you know what, the emotional decision making is kind of a crappy way to go. I can get everything I need to out of the emotional side of things and just attempt to jettison the emotional side. Curious of your opinion on that.
So I guess we had another event on emotions, and what I tried to argue, hopefully reasonably well, is that emotions are important and good, but the value of the emotions is to dig into the root cause of the emotions. And what I tried to make an argument is that the value of the emotions is understanding where those emotions are coming from a rational perspective. And that's where I would agree that emotional decisions are usually bad decisions. What I mean by that is a decision made for emotional reasons is usually a bad decision. But if you feel your emotions, you get in touch with your emotions, you understand why you're feeling those emotions. And I like to say, plant the seeds of happiness and pull out the weeds of harm from an emotional perspective, because emotions are delays of actions, right? They're quick to come, but they're always a long time in, like the seeds that were planted that created that emotional response were planted way before the emotional response happened and what you responded to. Like the seed was planted way earlier than that. And so I would argue what we have to do is, introspection. And that's why I say when we start to get emotional, best thing to do is to sit down, meditate, close your eyes, take some slow, deep breaths, try to calm yourself down, and then think rationally, why am I feeling these emotions? What is it that's making me feel these emotions? How can I get to the root cause of these emotions and what's causing them? And that's when we try to pull out the weeds of harm, meaning prevent ourselves from coming to, the source of negative emotions again. And how do we plant the seeds of happiness, meaning, try to, you know, basically create circumstances in which we're going to feel good emotions. Does that make sense, Carrie?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So
Yeah,
I don't think the
I'd fall on
emotions
the
are.
side where I'm generally, if I'm going to make an important decision, I'd try to keep emotion out of it as much as I possibly can.
Yeah. And I think that's a good idea because the decisions are generally better made in our rational part of our brain. But that doesn't mean we should ignore our emotions or stuff them down. We need to understand where the emotions are coming from because they always come from a place. Now, sometimes it's a place of misunderstanding, as
Yeah.
Carl was talking about earlier. And so then we need to ask thoughtful questions that make sure that the reason we're feeling those emotions is actually accurate. Because, we may have a misunderstanding about what we're upset about. And in that case, let's, get to clarity about whether or not we have a reason to be upset, and if so, what that reason is, because only then can we actually, plant the seeds of happiness and pull out the weeds of harm. Because if you don't, and that's what the first three intentions are about, quite frankly, is seeing the truth more clearly. Because if you can see the truth more clearly, then the fourth intention starts to make a lot of sense. If you don't even see the truth clearly, you might think you're preventing significant unnecessary harm when really you're causing it, which I would argue pretty much everybody that is causing significant unnecessary harm, I would say the vast majority anyway, think that they're being helpful. They just
Can I
have a
just can I
misunderstanding.
just quickly add to that?
Please.
ChatGPT is fantastic for that.
It
When you
is.
ask it, why did I act like this over there? What's all that about? And it's really helpful in digging deeper. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you, Mandy, for bringing that up. And in fact, please, no disrespect meant to the psychologists in the room, but ChatGPT has been shown to be a better therapist than therapists. And I'm not telling everyone to quit your therapist and use ChatGPT. That is not my advice. I'm just saying using ChatGPT to get, to bounce ideas off of is not a bad idea. Still good to have a therapist if you feel like you're getting value out of it. By all means, do it, but also recommend talking to ChatGPT, because it really gives good advice from the people that I know that have done it. They found it really useful. I haven't tried it myself personally, but that I everyone I know that's tried it has really liked it. So um,
It's already being used a lot in therapy
cool,
and therapy apps by far.
cool.
Yeah. Will, are you there?
Let me see if Jenna, we
Oh,
didn't see what you wrote in the chat. If you wanted to write what you wanted to say, I did want to address what you were trying to explain. I just didn't understand it, and I apologize for that. But I'm going to let Will go next. And Jenna, if you want to type what you were trying to say in the chat, I'll bring it up in the conversation as well. I'll try to keep an eye out for it. Will, go
I
ahead.
mean, well, thank you. I was just thinking with resentment and all emotions, negative and positive. I mean, we all our life we talk about emotions, and there's self-help books of the biggest the most widely selling books in secondhand shops are self-help books, apparently, because we read them, but it's very rare that we fundamentally change our behavior, whether we want to get rid of resentment or anger, whatever it might be. But there is a way to do it, and that's through meditation, where you actually modify your behavior. So that's all I wanted to say, really, because to me, it's like playing tennis. You can talk about tennis all day, or you can get on the court and actually play tennis. But if you really want to make significant changes, so many, probably hundreds of millions of people have found, you dedicate yourself to meditation. Now, I'm not saying I'm perfect. Anybody who knows me knows, like, I'm not perfect with my emotions, but it's helped me so much. And I just can't recommend it enough to people. Just meditate. And you don't have to talk about being resentful, because it all just falls into place naturally when you sort of dissolve the self to some degree, and you're not defending as big a target, because you kind of dissolve the self and the conceptualization of the self and the constant rumination. And then you kind of get into a flow. And again, I'm not saying I'm good at it, but I know what they're talking about. And it's just helped me so much. If it's okay, I'll just put a free meditation link in the chat to a Buddhist monk. It's the best meditations you will ever get. There's 44 of them. They all go for 20 minutes roughly. It's free. He's Professor of Theology, Alan Wallace, assistant to the Dalai Lama, and it is life-changing, I swear. So I'll put it in the chat, and that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Please do, Will, and put your meetup in the chat as well, Will. Thanks for your comments. I agree, meditation is super valuable. I do want to address what Jenna was saying, and she was basically saying that about emotional reactivity, that some people are tied up to entitlement for their freedom of speech, and that their freedom of speech oftentimes narrows down to merely articulating one's emotions and thoughts without really listening to others. And I agree with that, Jenna. And in fact, a lot of people, say things like, the facts don't care about your emotions, right? That's a very callous way of saying, your emotions don't matter. Whereas really, I think all of our emotions matter. And if facts are going to hurt someone's emotions, we should put them in the politest way possible. That's why our only rule, and I forgot to bring it up tonight, but everyone's been following it, which is to be polite, right? You can say unsavory things in the FTI, but you have to say it politely, because, it's just, we all deserve each other's respect here. And, saying things politely is how we respect each other. And even if we disagree with someone, we can say it respectfully. And even if we don't like someone, we can say it respectfully and politely. The Brits are really good at that. They have the snarkiest humor. And then she also said that, to Ari's point, isn't regret directed towards ourselves and resentment towards others? Yes, but actually, when I looked up, one definition of resentment includes resentment of one's own actions. So I think, you can kind of get both. And she also said that Rosa Parks was, felt anger towards unfairness and fueled her righteous indignation. And I agree with that. I think emotions have led to a lot of positive things when emotional responses and fairness are aligned, like they were probably in Rosa's case. And sometimes they do align, right? And sometimes our emotions lead us in the right direction because they're logically justified. I would just argue that if our emotions are leading us in a direction that's logically justified, we'll get to the exact same situation without feeling those emotions so strongly that we're making the decision out of an emotional place. And so much better to stay calm, cool, and collected, make the decision based on reason, and we'll still come to the same conclusion, but without the need to get emotional. Whereas when we get emotional, it's like, driving a car like at double the speed limit, right? Like, sure, like you're not necessarily going to get in a car accident, but you're much more at risk of getting into a car accident if you're doubling the speed limit. So better to just follow the speed limit and think rationally, rather than, go twice the speed limit and be emotional and hope that you end up not getting in a car accident. So
and driving, with a blindfold, and driving with a blindfold.
Right,
as well.
Exactly.
I
Ari,
was after I think I got knocked down when I spoke.
What's that, Carl? Oh, were you before Ari before?
Yeah, I was just got knocked
Okay,
out. Every
go
time
ahead.
I mentioned, well, you're next, or well, you're there. It just took me out. But anyway, I was gonna add to that, which I think kind of like right along what Will said, and and to Ari's point, was talking about what happens in your brain when you are, and the term is emotional flooding. So if you look at it as a flood, as opposed to just a little kind of like water leak somewhere. So what it does actually neuroscientifically in your brain is that it actually shuts down your prefrontal cortex when you are emotionally flooded. And for anyone who's ever had a fight with their spouse, and it's actually the number one thing that advice that couples counselings give, is that if you ever find yourself in a fight that escalates emotionally, you get emotionally flooded, you just have to be aware to just kind of like cut it off right there and just say, can we just stop for a minute, and then let me cool off a little bit. They cool off, because then you can actually think rationally. When you're emotionally flooded, it's almost impossible to think rationally and to make good decisions. So I'm sure everybody would relate to that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And emotional flooding is what I meant by intense feeling of emotion, right? That's what, I used to feel way more often, and now I feel much less. So now I have an emotional trickle. Now, the trick is, if you don't deal with an emotional trickle, then the water's going to build up and you're going to end up with a flood. So you got to deal with the emotions. You can't stuff them away. You got to deal with the root cause. But if you deal with the emotional trickle, then you don't end up with a flood. Ari, go ahead. Thanks, Carl, for that.
Mhm.
Thanks, guys. I'm mostly going to play a little game representing Kerry. I'm going to imagine I'm his lawyer, and he's said something about making decisions with using as little emotions as possible. And I think this is a very practical, almost like a nice stoic tool, because we can't, or at least a healthy person who's acknowledging their emotions. I'm not talking about the person who's in denial, but who's actually acknowledging and using what I'd call a full brain toolkit, which we'd call our navigational toolkit versus our survival toolkit, is acknowledging the emotions, but they're what we've all been saying, we're not letting them overtake us. And I wanted to talk about the brain science. And there's two specific things that are really powerful and important, that when our brain, or we feel stressed or even just really excited, really activated in any general brain region, what's happening is we're being flooded with a bunch of electricity and therefore heat, literal heat. We just get hot under the collar. There's more heat there, and there's more chemicals. And generally, when one part of the brain, generally it's the hypothalamus that everybody's interested, or the amygdala, these kind of things that deal with novelty, when they compartmentalize and take all of our blood, the blood that would go to our thinking regions, are oftentimes called the professor brain, the prefrontal cortex, there's a lot less blood there. We all feel this to some degree. If you see someone really attractive, your ability to think clearly is diminished. And what's happening is, when one part of the brain is compartmentalizingly sort of hijacking the whole brain, we're essentially acting like children. This is what children do. They have a less unified brain, and therefore they have a very reactive, or we have a very reactive response. But when we're deactivated and there's more fluid blood controlled everywhere, then what we're doing is a whole brain experience. And this is going to introduce an idea that we may want to talk about, or have another idea we can argue about for fun, is this idea of a rational thought and an emotional thought, or an emotional experience, are a whole brain experience. And it's a false dichotomy that among neuroscience has been completely debunked, along the lines of, like, if anybody knows the triune brain, there's the lizard brain, the mammal brain, and the human brain. That's all nonsense. Lizards have a prefrontal cortex and they use it. They just have a smaller one. And so this idea is that when we're making good decisions, the general idea is, as an adult, we're using a unified whole brain experience. And when we're making what we call in this room, we've been calling an emotional experience, we're actually just using a compartmentalized pathological response. And this is really not an emotional brain versus a rational brain. This is an emotional decision versus a rational decision. This is much more like an adult decision versus a childish decision. And we can all get triggered by certain things that get us into these child places where we just completely get flooded. And this makes sense too. Like, if we're getting hunted by a lion, it's not helpful to sit and think, oh, what should I do about it? It's much more helpful to just run or take action. And this is what evolution designed us for. And so the circuitry makes a lot of sense. There's also a famous thinker. There's a lot of people say this, but my favorite is Daniel Kahneman. The two thinking systems, the thinking fast and thinking slow, it literally takes longer for the electricity to get to our upper brain, where we have a more full brain experience. And it takes a lot less time to get to our lower brain, where these emotional feelings are. And that's where they get activated so fast and they can totally take over. And when one compartmental region of the brain takes over, then we have this bias like blindfold driving. And the last thing I want to say is that's also well understood in neuroscience is that when one of the brain regions gets totally activated, our time horizon is completely gone, meaning we can't see beyond this moment. And we think that this moment is the way it will always be. If our feelings are like weather, we see the current storm as having always been and always will be, as opposed to a calm or what we've been calling the rational sense of self. The adult self recognizes, oh, I'm in a storm, hunker down for a little bit, and it will pass. Right? So this is the difference between a full brain experience making good decisions and an integrated brain versus a disconnected brain with forms of pathology.
Yeah, so just I if I could, the lizard brain is I've heard normally referred to as the reptilian brain, and the reason that it's used is because it's really the earliest some of the earliest major forms of life, and it's used to represent the the fight or flight system. But
Sure, but even those lizards, these whatever the reptiles, they're
yeah,
invertebrates. As
yeah.
long as you're an invertebrate, they all have a
Again,
prefrontal
it's
cortex
not
too.
to say that it's a cold hard fast. There was no logical thinking to these animals. It's more that the primary, motivator of decision making is more about fight or flight for that brain type. So that was the reason that it was used in the triumvirate brain, as I understood it. But I'm just picking nits here, Ari. It's
Yeah, no,
super
but it's
important. So
welcome to say for anybody who wants to learn and update that this is a mythology that's outdated. Like smoking is good for you. It's just not true.
I've seen the criticism, and I think we can agree to disagree on that one because it's not tonight's topic. But um,
Sure.
yeah, there's a lot of good argument for the general theme of logical part of the brain, emotional part of the brain, and fight or flight part of the brain, whether you want to call them reptilian, mammalian, or whatever. The fact that your logic can be circumvented by emotions and that fight or flight can circumvent emotions is pretty clear to me. Like it's
Well, I
hard
want
to
to make the point that emotions can be highly rational and being rational can be highly irrational, right? So this is again a false dichotomy.
being rational can be highly irrational.
Right, you can rationalize very irrational decisions. You can make very irrational, biased, bad decisions based on rationalizing. It's using logic and thoughts to construct a whole bunch of cherry picking nonsense. Right.
Well,
So again,
that's not rational thought. It's pseudo-rational thought. It's masking irrationality
so
in
so
rational
now we have to
sense.
define our terms because I think we're just getting to that I define rationality differently than you do.
Okay. Well,
That's a
let's
different discussion.
yeah,
Yeah,
different discussion. Let's get to Carrie, and um
absolutely.
I would take on that, but I'm very tired, so if we don't have a lot of other questions, we may just end
No
early
worries. I'm just
tonight.
having fun and thanks
Yeah,
everybody. So yeah.
no worries. I appreciate your comments as always, Ari. Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. And just to be clear, I'm not saying anyone is saying I was saying this, but I don't think the goal is that we just become like unfeeling automatons, right? It's
Right,
just that we're not beholden to our emotional states where it's controlling us.
right.
And the other thing though, the point I want to make is that, this stimulus response that results in our emotional content. This stuff is not constant over time. You know, uh, there's this phenomenon called adrenaline inoculation, right? When you're put in scary situations repeatedly, you get used to it. And it gets to the point where you don't necessarily have that fight, flight, or freeze response, but you can actually think more intelligently about how you want to deal with it. Um, and most folks would say you make much better decisions in those situations if you have some level of adrenaline inoculation. Um, Now I'm going to backtrack on everything that I've said a bit and say, I think this was a conversation I had um, earlier with Carl. What role does the gut play in all of this? Because there's this idea that we circumscribe this area that maybe is emotion based and give it a privileged spot, right? Where it's like, I want to make my gut happy because it's looking out for me. So I include it as kind of this companion or guardian angel that's looking out for me that I don't necessarily ascribe rationality to, but I do pay attention to it. So I'm curious how that fits into the equation in the way we're
Actually,
talking about it.
Gary, yeah, no, you're actually right. It actually research that shows that the gut microbiome is actually our second brain. It actually your gut makes like 90% of your serotonin. Uh, it's amazing. Yeah, they actually talk to each other, and so that's the whole thing about gut feelings is
Did
not that far.
you did you
Yeah.
mean that version of gut, or did you mean like following your gut instinct?
I meant gut instinct, but I
That's what
like
I
where
thought.
Carl's going there. It may
My
be
point is
related.
that it's the
Carl
same.
Carl is
It's
right,
the
and I'm not disagreeing with you, Carl. The microbiome is super important, and gut bacteria is super important. But I knew where you were going with Carl, and if I could, I'm going to respond to that. Although I will tell everyone, learn about the gut biome. There's a lot going on there. It's new science, and it's very interesting. There's a lot to learn there. We should probably do an event on the gut biome, the microbiome. Although I'm not qualified to speak about it, I might be able to do a bunch of research and become qualified as I've done in the past. So,
It
um,
brings new context to the term shit for brains.
so
it does.
leaving
Good.
that one aside,
Sorry.
the experience that I've had is like trusting in my gut has generally been where sometimes I will make and this gets to what Ari was saying about that will rationally justify things that are emotional decisions. I have in my past made emotional decisions without even realizing I did, and I made rational excuses for those emotional decisions. My gut was telling me, it was screaming at me actually, no, this isn't the right thing, but I wasn't listening to my gut, right? And I ignored it until it became unignorable, and eventually I sided with my gut. But I would say that the gut instinct is usually, in my experience, when we're not properly dealing with the root causes of our emotions. And if we are properly dealing with the root causes of our emotions, I think our gut is generally aligned with our reason. But if we're making emotional decisions and we're using reason to rationalize our emotional decisions, our gut will be the thing trying to save us from ourselves and saying, no, this isn't the right thing. Trust your gut. And I would argue when we're in tune with our rational selves, our gut is aligned with our rational thinking when we're actually really following our rational thinking and understanding our emotions, dealing with our emotions for what they are, and recognizing if they're trying to steer us in a bad direction. And the other thing I would say is a gut a gut instinct generally will be the thing that steers us right if we're trying to tell the difference between doing something that's fair or unfair. And I like to joke about the Looney Tunes cartoons that some of us at my age group grew up with, where there's a little angel on one shoulder and a little devil on the other shoulder, and they're both whispering at the character, and he's got to figure out which one to listen to. Our gut will tell us to listen to the angel, and we don't always listen to the angel, although I would love to say I always do. I'm certainly much better about it than I was when I was a kid. I almost always listen to it now. But I'll tell you, when I was younger, I was not always listening to the angel. So
So is the gut a refined emotional correction mechanism?
Maybe.
maybe,
Or like
yeah,
Yeah.
a governor, some kind of check and balance?
I
I
think
mean,
it's
we
actually,
know that the gut talks to the brain all the time. There's the vagus nerve. That's a established fact now, right? They talk to each other.
well,
And so
again,
this
you're
whole idea of
talking,
gut instinct is scientific now. It's not just like a
yeah.
ether.
I don't know though if that's what I don't know if people when they say gut instinct that they mean that their gut is the thing telling them because I don't think we ever know really what our gut bacteria is telling us per se.
Right. Right. We don't have the
Maybe,
research yet, but there's
but
enough to know that
I
they're
think
talking.
though, I think that Carrie's kind of right in that like our gut instinct, like when we talk about gut instinct, I think it's an innate sense of right and wrong that I will argue that we are all born with, the innate sense of what's right and wrong. It's through conditioning and misunderstandings that we do things that are wrong, thinking that they're right. And that's why the first three intentions are all focused on combating misunderstandings and getting closer to truth, because by getting closer to truth, we can then be more fair, which is why the fourth intention is really clearly defining fairness. I would argue we all have the inherent feeling of wanting to be fair, which is why it's part of the first intention, because we all inherently know we want to be fair. But I would argue actually taking action that is fair has to come after we see the truth more clearly. And so the intentions are very carefully constructed to follow a priority order. And I do think that, the gut is what keeps us on point if we follow it. And, have regretted far more when I didn't listen to my gut than I can't think of times that I did follow my gut and it steered me wrong. But
Anybody
yeah,
read Blink by Malcolm?
yeah, it's a great book.
Yeah, that's kind of along those lines that
It is.
we see more than we think we do, or there's more communication than we think, and there's that part of that instinct that we talked about. Yeah.
Yep, definitely. Ari, go ahead.
That's a fantastic. I was thinking about Blink and Malcolm Gladwell, but he's not a neuroscientist, but he basically agrees and represents the neuroscience in a really straightforward manner. And the idea is that when we think of consciousness, there's really self-consciousness, what you and I are aware of right now when we presently, almost like we're watching the movie of ourselves very accurately. But the screen, the projector that's actually making the experience happens beforehand. The perfect example is that let's say I decide to have an apple and then I think, oh, I want an apple and I go get it. My brain and my mouth and a lot of parts of my body ahead of time have already made decisions up to 5 seconds ahead of time, like salivating saliva, that it wants to eat the apple long before I even have that thought. And so the idea is the gut, is often in neuroscience referred to as the intuitive self, which is if we're an iceberg, that there's 95% of us that's conscious, and the 5% that we think that we're aware of, we misrepresent as 100%. And so the 95% is what's going on with this blink. We get all this information, we process summaries of it and summaries of the summaries in these neural columns. And only at the very top layer of those do we feel awareness. And that happens later. It takes longer. But the earlier things give us what we call impressions, if you're talking about David Hume, or in neuroscience, it's called affect. But these senses of feelings, and it's generally, now this is a point of contention, but it's generally agreed upon that this is mostly happening in the midbrain and the lower brain before it gets to the upper brain. So the gut that Carl's talking about is totally different. Not that I'm going to say he's wrong, because our gut microbiome does completely have decision-making capabilities, but it's generally not represented like this. It's almost just two different ideas that have the same word. And the general idea that I present that has a lot of robust literature is that the gut feelings is in our intuition that comes almost precognitive in the sense of the pre-words. They're concepts that start to form, but before we actually get words. And the idea of, well, I don't want to get into the argument, but as you say, a full emotion concept requires a word to create the goal. And beforehand, we can have impressions and feelings about this. And they're generally, again, in neuroscience, they find that decision making with the gut is actually highly accurate in terms of predictive power. So it's generally a well agreed upon thing that it's good. And it's mostly the midbrain as opposed to what we call the rational brain.
Ari, we did an event on consciousness, and I tried to give an explanation of the reason that people say that decisions are made before we're conscious of them, and sort of how that mechanism works. So I would be curious to get your feedback on that if you weren't here for that one. If you
Did you
are,
want me to talk right now or give other people a chance? I don't see any hands up.
well, I don't think
I
you.
can speak very briefly. The idea is decisions are definitely mostly made ahead of time. And what we do when we watch the movie afterwards, that way we get to adjust future decisions. And so that's the value of the rational brain with thoughts. Wait, but the special one was about how decisions are made. Was that it? I
So,
kind of brain
so I
farted
think
there.
what I would love for you to do is watch the event on consciousness and then give
Mm.
me feedback on that as a
Okay, fine.
neuroscientist after
Sure.
you read it, because I have my
Sure.
hypothesis on how consciousness functions. And I try to give an explanation for why we observe what we do experimentally around consciousness and
Hmm.
where the origin of decisions is specifically. And so,
Yeah.
if I'm right, it's news. But
Okay.
I would love your feedback on it.
Sure. Yeah, I have my own thoughts. I guess I'll say real quickly the idea of free will and a misconception in the neuroscience world of the illusion of free will. The illusion of free will is that it's in the 5%, and that it's our self that we are thinking, you and I watching each other. That's where the free will is. No, the free will, if it really exists, which I believe it does, but it's arguable, is definitely in the 95% region. That's where decision making is really happening.
When you say the 95% region, what do you mean by that?
The precognitive, the stuff we have before we have these thoughts, generally.
Right.
Like, right? So, in terms of really processing the data and what's called active inference, and this information as it comes from bottom up, and is processed, is, that's the iceberg. That's 95% below the surface, and that's where decision making almost entirely happens. And the reflexive thoughts that we have later, that literally reflecting on these things in a deliberate way, definitely is a marginal aspect of free will, but it has nothing to do with the free will that's happening now or that has happened. It's only able to then change our neuroplasticity for the future, affect future decisions, but not current decisions or past or decisions that we're already making.
Ari, can I ask you a question?
Please.
When you say 95% decisions happening below the surface, in a sense, isn't that an argument for determinism more than free will?
No. So the point is, it is, and generally that's the misconception, that if there's free will, it's happening there. But no one can say very well that there isn't the free will happening or there isn't determinism. But the idea is we're making active inference through self-evidencing, and that almost entirely happens below the awareness circuits, what we call the regular conscious, or in like psychodynamics, Jungian, they would call this the ego or the archetypes, right? But they're actually where the decision makings are made. But many people believe that there are really decisions being made, which implies free will, as opposed to just determinate. But there's a lot of people also who say, no, this is all just automatic, entropic decisions that are naturally cascading, and there is no
Garrett made an argument for free will, but Robert Sapolsky would argue it's 100%, not 95%.
Yeah, Robert has a lot of misunderstandings. With all due respect, he's a smart guy, but he's got a lot of misunderstandings. I can shoot holes in his argument like Swiss cheese. But I would love to debate him on the topic someday. But
well, Garrett and I are not going to be able to
to
argue here, because I also believe in free will. But the point is, it's the difference between what we can evidence and prove versus what we can disprove. And so you can't disprove free will, but it's very hard to prove free will.
Watch the argument on the second link that I put, Ari, because I try to prove free will.
Fantastic. I'd love to see it.
Cool. Mandy, go ahead.
I wanted to ask you, when you're looking at consciousness and all this stuff, and even you said the biome for the belly, do you look at anything that comes out of India? Because they have a lot of knowledge about the mind, the body, and the spirit. Or would that make this a spiritual group then?
So we're a free thinker group. So we have determinists, we have free will advocates, we have atheists, we have religious people, we have spiritual people. I tend to take the middle road. I'm spiritual, not religious, but my opinions are just my opinions. We have a wide, diverse group of opinions here, and there's no objective right or wrong. When anyone says that I'm wrong, I say, well, excuse me, but I don't remember anyone telling me that you were the sole arbiter of objective truth. Last I heard that position has not yet been filled by you. And if you were that person, no one told me. So I just want to say we share opinions freely here, and we share all opinions openly, and we listen to each other with an open mind, hopefully, and yeah. So there's no real boundaries other than remaining polite in the group.
Yeah, because I've learned a lot from the Indian thought and understanding of why we're here and all that, and I've not wanted to, because I'm British, but there's you have to actually do the work. Like, you can't be, you can read it, you got to understand it, you got to do the actual work of it. And I find it so they have a lot of knowledge. It's the oldest philosophies in the world as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Totally agree.
the oldest, largest organized religion in the world is Hinduism for sure. But
Yeah,
you
but
know,
even before Hinduism, the Vedas,
well, Hinduism is, on top of the Vedas. So, the
below the
Vedas.
Vedas. The
What's
Vedas
that?
are above.
Mm.
Hindus have come out of Vedas, but the
Yeah,
Veda,
what I'm saying is Hinduism is built on top of the Vedas.
yes. But if you scrap Hinduism and go straight to the Vedas, which is actually what the science of yoga, it's phenomenal. And
Yeah.
the sister science of Ayurveda with food, when you were talking about the emotions, yeah, there's that thing, what do they call it? Hungry? Like if you're hungry and you're like so
Irritable.
much comes out of the belly as well with the
Yeah.
emotion. So there's a
Absolutely.
huge connection right there.
Yeah, I get
Anyways,
hangry.
I wanted to say
Actually,
that,
not
and
as
I
much
also
as used to, but I used to get hangry.
and I wanted to say it's 10 to, so if you have any closing remarks, that I really appreciate that because my brain works that way. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for reminding me. So, you had really good suggestion to do closing remarks, Mandy. You have to keep coming to remind me to do that because I have a terrible memory and I do want to remember to do it. So, if you guys don't mind, I might do some closing remarks now, because I'm super tired, if you couldn't tell. And so, I'll close 5 or 10 minutes early, but. I first want to thank everybody for coming, and the great conversation and questions. For closing remarks, I want to say I didn't hear a good reason that we should get emotionally flooded. I'm going to use that term because I think that's what I meant by overcome with emotion. We should, keep our emotions in check, but not by stuffing them down. We should acknowledge our emotions, acknowledge them in a calm, cool, collected way. Meditation and breathing exercises really help do that if you're already full of emotional flooding. Close your eyes and think about things in a rational way and slow deep breathing until you can do that and keep your mind calm. And when you do that, if you analyze the root cause of your emotions and learn the lessons you need to learn from why you felt those emotions, then there's no need to allow the emotional flooding to come. And as you practice doing this, I think you'll find that if you continue to address your emotions when they're a trickle, you're not going to feel like they need to flood in order to get their point across to you. Because I think everyone was right that the emotions are there to hit us over the head when we're not listening to them. If we listen to them, we're attuned to them, not only our emotions, which is about emotional control, but also to other people's emotions and, being in tune with the emotions of the people we're interacting with and addressing their emotions and asking them what they're feeling and why they're feeling it. When we can do those things and be in attune with our own emotions and those of others and deal with the root causes of all the emotions present, then we can actually, address them in a calm, cool, collected way that leads to an increase in happiness and decrease in harm after we prevent all significant unnecessary harm, which is what we try to do in the FTI. And I forgot to post, and it's already a little late, but I'm going to post it anyway. I hope you guys will join us next week. We're going to talk about exploring food and music together. We're going to have a guest speaker, so I get a week off, and we'll have a guest speaker talking about exploring food and music together. And hopefully you guys will find it interesting. She has at least a unique thing. It's a musical cookbook. So I thought it was a fascinating thing. So I wanted to have her present about it, and you can see what you think of it. So that said, I hope that people can learn tonight that from tonight that addressing your emotions is important. Address them at the root cause. Learn the lessons you need to learn and then focus your thoughts on the past towards either learning lessons or reminiscing, and don't spend any other effort or time on the past. Just learn and reminisce and have a great night. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Garrett,
And
sorry to interrupt. I put a
yeah, go
link in
ahead.
the chat. People are hungry for further discussion. There's another meeting on in 90 minutes. If anybody wants to keep chatting for Zoom addicts, meetup addicts like me, it's in the chat. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Will.
See you next
Have a
week,
good night,
guys.
everyone. I have to sleep. So thanks and talk to you guys. I hope to see you guys next week.